It was supposed to be just another Thursday segment on the widely viewed political roundtable show The People's Forum, a live-stream debate room that had recently surged in popularity for bringing high-profile figures into unfiltered discussions. That week's theme was advertised as a conversation about trust in American institutions, but viewers tuning in that day were unaware they were about to witness a confrontation that would dominate the internet and cable news cycles for days to come. Karoline Leavitt, the polished and sharp-tongued political commentator known for her unwavering defense of conservative values, had accepted the invitation to debate Jasmine Crockett, a rising Democratic figure whose unapologetic fire and courtroom tenacity had turned her into a favorite among progressive circles. The producers, eager to capitalize on their opposing energy, placed them on either side of the panel with two neutral commentators in between. What began as measured debate quickly devolved into a collision of egos, ideology, and raw personal frustration. The moment the camera lights went live, both women maintained an air of professionalism. Jasmine leaned into her usual rhythm, emphasizing systemic failures and calling for institutional accountability, particularly regarding recent controversial statements made by administration officials. Karoline countered with cool, data-backed critiques, challenging what she called performative outrage and pushing the conversation toward responsibility on both ends of the aisle. For a while, it was compelling political theater, sharp but respectful. Then Jasmine brought up an explosive report circulating in the media, alleging that several officials had manipulated public narratives through private influence on social media platforms. She didn't name Karoline directly, but the implication was clear. According to Jasmine, certain conservative figures were involved in spreading misinformation that endangered public trust. She questioned how people in positions of media power could sleep at night, knowing they helped destabilize truth for political gain. Her voice began to rise, and the panel grew quiet. Karoline waited, not with silence, but with intent. Her composure didn't crack, but something in her gaze shifted. She didn't take kindly to what she perceived as a veiled attack. When she responded, it wasn't with a defense, but with an assertive counteroffensive. She dismantled Jasmine's argument point by point, pivoting the conversation from general media distrust to specific incidents in which Jasmine had, in Karoline's view, fueled divisiveness through performative outrage. She brought receipts, old footage, social media posts, and inconsistencies in Jasmine's record. She didn't yell. She didn't need to. Jasmine, taken off guard, tried to redirect the conversation back to institutional problems, but the tide had turned. Karoline now controlled the room. The audience, both in studio and online, began to lean in. It was no longer a debate. It was a dissection. At this point, Jasmine's expressions began to shift, cycling through disbelief, frustration, and defiance. Her usual cadence, so commanding in hearings and interviews, now seemed slightly out of rhythm. She attempted to regain footing by accusing Karoline of deflecting and ignoring the real harms caused by conservative media figures, but her argument no longer landed with the same force. Karoline didn't let up. Her tone stayed controlled, her pacing methodical. She reminded the panel and the viewers of moments when inflammatory rhetoric had resulted in public tension, naming instances Jasmine had celebrated without acknowledging their unintended consequences. It wasn't just rebuttal, it was exposure. Every time Jasmine tried to shift the focus, Karoline calmly steered it back to her inconsistencies. The other commentators remained still, their roles reduced to spectators. What was once a roundtable had become a one-on-one match, and the imbalance was growing more obvious by the minute. The moderators, caught between keeping the peace and letting the moment unfold, chose the latter. They understood the gravities of what was happening. The comment section on the live stream erupted with reactions. Some viewers were shocked, others thrilled. A few begged the moderators to intervene, but most simply wanted to see how far this would go. And it wasn't over. Jasmine Crockett was no stranger to high-pressure confrontations. Her political career had been built on cutting through noise and demanding accountability in rooms that often resisted it. But this time, something was different. She wasn't up against a bureaucrat dodging questions or a colleague grandstanding for attention. She was facing Karoline Leavitt, methodical, unshakable, and disturbingly well-prepared. And now, in front of a live national audience, Jasmine found herself not only on the defensive, but dangerously close to losing control of the conversation entirely. The moment Karoline calmly shifted the spotlight to a clip of Jasmine from just months ago, passionately condemning media suppression while now decrying platforms that refuse to moderate speech, the tone of the entire panel changed. The contrast was undeniable, and Karoline knew exactly how to wield it. She framed it not as hypocrisy, but as selective outrage, suggesting that Jasmine's sense of justice bent with the political winds. The statement was layered, sharp enough to sting, but structured to appear civil. It was a rhetorical trap, and Jasmine stepped straight into it. She fired back with renewed intensity, her voice rising as she accused Karoline of engaging in intellectual dishonesty. Her hands moved as fast as her words, gesturing with increasing fervor as she attempted to assert dominance through volume. But the emotional surge that once energized her supporters now risked working against her. For every passionate declaration she made, Karoline answered with precision and poise. Her responses weren't louder, they were colder, clearer, and delivered with the kind of calm that disarmed every escalation. In trying to fight fire with fire, Jasmine inadvertently gave Karoline the exact contrast she needed. The more Jasmine burned, the more Karoline cooled, and the viewers could feel it. Jasmine reached for moral ground, invoking historical injustices and the lived realities of marginalized communities, hoping to redirect the debate toward broader systemic issues. She wanted to appeal to conscience, to shift the focus away from her personal contradictions and onto collective responsibility. But Karoline didn't follow her there. She refused to let the conversation drift. Instead, she acknowledged those injustices without hesitation, then circled back to her central point. That moral urgency cannot justify intellectual inconsistency. And then Karoline delivered a blow that reverberated across the studio. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't even punctuated with visible satisfaction. It was simply delivered as fact. She referenced a closed-door event where Jasmine had reportedly brushed off a key question about social media censorship with a dismissive joke. The moment had never made headlines. It wasn't part of public discourse, but somehow Karoline had it. And just like that, she revealed she had sources closer to Jasmine's inner circle than anyone had realized. Jasmine's face froze for a beat too long. Her next sentence came stilted, her timing fractured. The panel noticed. So did the viewers. It wasn't just an embarrassing moment, it was a power shift. The comment feed exploded again, with hashtags forming in real time. Even some of Jasmine's supporters began questioning why she appeared rattled, and why Karoline seemed to know more than she should. The producers leaned in, aware they were sitting on a viral moment. Sensing the momentum, Karoline leaned forward slightly. Not physically, but through presence alone. Her voice remained level, but her points began to carry a heavier edge. She didn't just argue now. She interrogated. With each reply, she forced Jasmine to explain herself, to clarify stances that had always existed in ambiguity. And each clarification opened another door for critique. Jasmine tried to rally, calling out the dangers of manipulative framing and how narratives could be twisted by those who had no real understanding of oppression. She invoked her community, her story, her purpose. But Karoline met even that with unnerving readiness, stating that personal history does not exempt public figures from responsibility or from being questioned. By the time the moderators stepped in to pause the segment for a brief break, the energy in the room had shifted entirely. Jasmine stared ahead, her jaw set but her eyes restless. Karoline, meanwhile, remained poised, as though the last 30 minutes had required no effort at all. What had begun as a platform for political discourse had transformed into something far more personal, and while Jasmine had started the show with fire, it was Karoline who now held the torch. The producers cut to a commercial break, but the damage had already taken root. Jasmine Crockett sat rigid, her gaze distant as producers hovered off camera. Her team rushed to slide her notes closer, whispering rapid updates, but her mind was already elsewhere, replaying the last few minutes, trying to pinpoint where control had slipped through her fingers. She wasn't used to being backed into corners. This wasn't the floor of the house, where she could dominate through impassioned monologue. This was a curated battlefield, and Karoline Leavitt had brought a scalpel instead of a sword. When the cameras resumed, the tone was noticeably colder. Even the moderators, once energized, were now wary. It was no longer just a political discussion. It had evolved into a high-stakes personal conflict, and the audience could sense the unraveling tension behind every word. Jasmine came out swinging. With no room left to retreat, she doubled down. She questioned Karoline's credibility, her motivations, even the ethics of someone who, in Jasmine's words, weaponized isolated moments to misrepresent decades of lived struggle. She brought up Karoline's affiliations, past alliances, and media appearances. Her voice returned to full volume, but this time it had a sharpness laced with frustration. Her body leaned forward now, no longer relaxed but assertive, insistent. She demanded to know who Karoline truly represented, and whether someone who had never walked the path of systemic oppression had the right to lecture anyone on moral clarity. There was a flash of applause from some corners of the audience. For a brief moment it seemed Jasmine had wrestled the tone back in her favor. But Karoline did not flinch. She waited. And when the timing was right, she launched into what would become the most defining part of the entire debate. She spoke slowly now, deliberately. She recounted a story from earlier that year, one that had never made headlines, but that came with corroboration. It involved a private meeting with community organizers where Jasmine had allegedly dismissed a media ethics proposal aimed at reducing online division, laughing off concerns that partisan influencers, including some of her own allies, might be contributing to misinformation. Karoline outlined the dates, the location, even who was in the room. Then she brought up a leaked email, verified by multiple sources, in which Jasmine's office had discouraged a journalist from asking questions about the incident. A quiet hush fell across the panel. The moderators went silent. Jasmine blinked hard, stunned by the specificity. She began to speak but stopped mid-sentence. The studio felt suspended in time. And that's when Karoline turned everything personal. Without anger, without mockery, she began to break down how Jasmine's rising fame had shifted her message, how her image had evolved from grassroots warrior to media darling, how, in Karoline's view, Jasmine had traded consistency for virality, abandoning principle the moment applause became a currency more valuable than progress. It wasn't an accusation. It was a narrative, a clean arc, one Karoline delivered with surgical calm. Jasmine stood her ground, her expression hardening. She called Karoline cold, detached from the realities of people who had suffered. She asked how someone with so little personal stake in the struggle could sleep at night tearing down the work of those who fought for equity. But Karoline was ready for that too. She responded with something that made even the audience shift in their seats. She said the people deserved leaders who could take criticism without hiding behind their identity. That true leadership meant being held to the same standard you demanded of others. And in that moment, the audience turned. Not because Karoline was more likable or more impassioned, but because she had played the long game. She had painted Jasmine into a rhetorical corner, and when Jasmine struck back with emotion, Karoline countered with restraint. Every viewer watching, whether they supported her or not, understood the shift. Jasmine no longer looked like the fighter. She looked like the one trying to hold on. The chat feed flooded with reactions. Clips from the debate began circulating. In real time, a trending tag formed around Karoline's name, calling her performance calculated, fearless, and relentless. Meanwhile, Jasmine's defenders scrambled to reframe the narrative, but the clip of her speechless pause next to Karoline's unshaken expression had already begun looping across platforms. By the end of the segment, the moderators barely attempted to steer the conversation. The debate had grown too big for them to contain. They closed the show with hasty platitudes about mutual respect and the value of disagreement, but no one was listening. Jasmine remained seated longer than anyone else as the credits rolled. Karoline, meanwhile, stood and thanked the producers, with quiet composure before walking off the set. Still steady, still in control. By the following morning, the fallout was undeniable. Clips from the talk room had dominated every major news outlet. Social media feeds were saturated with side-by-side screenshots of Jasmine Crockett mid-outburst and Karoline Leavitt, leaning back with unflinching calm. Every gesture, every word, every pause had been dissected by millions. Political commentators weighed in across networks, but no one could deny the sheer impact of what had unfolded live on national television. Karoline didn't need to speak again. She had already won. Within hours, headlines praised her performance as tactically brilliant, calling it a rare example of grace under pressure in a media landscape saturated with noise. Even some commentators who typically disagreed with her politics begrudgingly acknowledged the strength of her composure. She hadn't raised her voice once, yet managed to leave a much louder mark than anyone else in the room. Jasmine, on the other hand, found herself grappling with unexpected blowback. While her supporters initially rallied to defend her, the video evidence was too clear to spin. Her emotional escalation, her deflections, and the visible cracks in her delivery had taken on a life of their own. She issued a brief public statement blaming the format of the show and accusing the network of manufacturing confrontation for ratings, but the damage had already been done. What made it worse was the response from within her own circle. A few quiet murmurs began surfacing. Staffers who had cautioned her to be more selective about public debates. Colleagues who had once praised her fire but now worried about her judgment under pressure. It wasn't just a bad day. It was a reputational bruise that would take time to fade. Meanwhile, Karoline's public image surged. She was invited onto multiple national programs to discuss the debate, each time reiterating her points without gloating. Her answers were measured, respectful, and sharp, striking the perfect tone between confident and controlled. Even her critics began cautioning others not to underestimate her again. She had proven that she could do more than just spar. She could dominate, and she had done it without throwing a single insult. Behind the scenes, producers from the talk room were already in discussions about how to replicate the success of the broadcast. Viewership had tripled within 24 hours. Advertisers called in droves. But the show's hosts privately acknowledged that what had happened wasn't just good television. It was a cultural flashpoint. It had exposed the deep, emotional undercurrents in American political discourse. It had shown what happened when outrage met precision, and at the center of it all stood Karoline Leavitt. Her team seized the opportunity, launching a campaign centered not around political ideology, but around clarity, confidence, and control. They didn't need to embellish. The footage spoke for itself. For Jasmine, the lesson was sobering. She had walked into the studio expecting another spirited debate. What she encountered instead was a calculated dismantling of her public persona, one that unfolded slowly, methodically, and without a single moment of obvious aggression. In the days that followed, she returned to her routine. She delivered speeches. She met with constituents. But something had shifted. Reporters who once gave her the benefit of the doubt now asked sharper questions. Opponents felt emboldened. Supporters grew quieter. The echo of that debate followed her, haunting press rooms and comment sections alike. And Karoline? She kept moving forward, undeterred, unemotional, and unshaken. Her victory wasn't just in that single moment on stage. It was in what came after. The silence that followed Jasmine's fury, the control she maintained while others unraveled, and the undeniable fact that, even when the argument turned personal, she never blinked. By the end of the week, one truth had become crystal clear to everyone watching. Karoline Leavitt didn't just win the debate, she owned it. And Jasmine Crockett, once the face of impassioned resistance, had been outmaneuvered in front of the very audience she once commanded.